And good morning, everybody. We are live. Congratulations. You made it through the week. It's Friday, and you have successfully put another week of food safety quality assurance in the bag, making sure that the products that you manufacture are keeping everybody happy and healthy. And as Cara and I like to say here on the show, if nobody says it, we're going to say it to you here right now. Good job. Good job. We're really proud of everything that you did this week. If you're new to the show, this is the Food Safety Chat Live. And every Friday at this time, 8 a.m. Mountain Time, 10 a.m. Eastern, we get together and have a nice informal conversation around food safety. And I bring a guest in. And if you're familiar with the chat, you're going to be happy because Cara's back on the show. She's always the best. Hi, Cara with ChemStation.
Hi.
How are you doing today?
Good, really good. Good.
Good. And so we
Happy
were
to be
chatting a
here.
little bit here. So you may notice here, if you're a regular as well, that Cara's got a different background here. So she's in a brand new house and is looking awesome. I love the bookshelves. That's a
Oh, thank
great
you. Those are all
idea.
my cookbooks. I'm kind of a cookbook hoarder.
Oh, that's kind of sad, isn't it, with the internet now, right? So whenever I'm looking at making something, I just go online and I'm like, okay, apple pie, and I just pull up a recipe. And kind of that tactile cookbook approach, it kind of goes away. It's kind of sad, isn't it?
Yeah, I love cook. I went shopping last weekend and ended up in a bookstore and bought three more. I just can't help myself. I just love them. So,
I love it. I still have some of mine, and I have some like from my mom from the
yep,
70s, like the Betty Crocker cookbooks that are in the 3-ring binders.
yep,
And also, so my family's from Iowa, and the cookbooks where the local community would get together at the church or whatever
yep.
and put together a cookbook.
Yep, I have a bunch of they're on my wall. I love those because you always find the really unique, Of course, you get the Jello salads and things like
Mhm.
that, but with the carrots in them. Remember those?
Oh my God. Yeah, the Jello molds and yeah, things that we just don't make anymore. It's kind of funny, isn't it?
Yeah. But I love them. I love to read those. So.
Oh, and so if you're new to the chat, and we're seeing some of our lovely happy people showing in here, what you'll notice here, what people are doing is they're putting in where they're from, which helps, I think, connect us together because food safety is all around the world. It's everywhere. And I'm in Colorado and Cara's in Wisconsin. And this is just a great way to help build this community. So everybody, it's great to see you here this morning. So one of the things you'll notice with the chat here as well is this is not a presentation. We are here to have a conversation. And a lot of times in food safety, Cara, one of the things that is really hard is we get kind of trapped in this bubble, don't we? We talk to the same people, we go to the conference, and we're in our own little world. And one of the things with food safety that I think is really amazing is there's slight differences between the different industries, but there's so much more in common. So when you're working for a sanitation chemical company like ChemStation, you get to see these different varieties of companies and get to play in different areas. But if you work in dairy, you mainly talk with dairy people. And the same goes for beef and produce and all of these type of things too. But a lot of the things that happen in these other areas, you can apply to yours as well. So for example, I mean, just think of all the work that has taken place in the meat industry and improvements in sanitation and all the different methodologies they come up with for helping to clean different surfaces and things like this that have translated over. So we can learn from each other for sure.
Absolutely. And yeah, I have the privilege of working with all different types of commodities, which is a privilege. And it is it helps me so much to be able to help other people,
Mhm.
right? Because you're absolutely right. Food safety, it crosses barriers. There's no, it's not siloed, right?
Yeah.
It shouldn't be siloed.
Yeah, and I saw this is kind of a little off topic, but I saw a really impressive post on LinkedIn yesterday. There was a CEO of a food company who said, "Woo, we just went through our toughest FDA audit ever." And he actually posted the inspection letter from FDA online. And it
Wow.
wasn't perfect. They had
Right.
like 3 observations. And he said on there, my quality team was warning me that we needed to do this, and I didn't listen. And I've learned my lesson. And I
Yeah.
was like, that's a good CEO right there.
That
That,
is that,
yeah.
own it. right? Yeah, you
Yeah.
have to own food safety. Yeah.
Yep. And most people, and this is true of people everywhere, Cara, is that people don't like to admit they're wrong. And
Nope.
I think in a lot of ways, online social media has exacerbated this. And people get in an argument just for argument's sake, and by God, they're not going to lose. And sometimes it's a much higher character to just say, "Wow, I hadn't thought about that. You're right."
Yep.
And it's a rare
I
thing nowadays.
agree. Yeah, and I think you learn from each other too, right?
Mhm.
And there's a lot of things that I don't know, and that's what I always tell my teams. And I always say, ask me all the questions that you want. I may not know the answer, but I will find it.
Yep.
Through my connections, and I'm always willing to admit, I don't know.
Right.
I can't know everything, right?
Well,
So
and that's 100% true, right? Is especially in what we do. We become specialists in particular areas. And the important part is learning who the other experts are and being able to
exact.
reach out to those people, pick up the phone and say, "Hey, I got a question." and
Yes. Yeah.
I've also heard that as well, is that one of the signs of intelligence is recognizing that you don't know everything. It's the know-it-alls who think they know everything and that they've got all the answers. It's kind of the opposite, right?
Right. Exactly. Exactly. I agree 100%.
Yeah. So with that, and one of the things that I always want to do, because today's topic is one I think impacts everybody, is very important. But before we begin, everybody, please join Cara and I for a ceremonial drink. I love that mug.
It's from Maine. So I got it out in Maine. It has little birch trees on it.
Oh,
It's
that's
kind of
gorgeous.
small though, so I have to drink like 7 of them to really.
Cheers, everyone. Very good. Very good. Mohammed in Oman, nice to see you again today. Joanne, get to see Joanne. Joanne and I used to work together in the past. Joanne's fantastic at what she does, so I'm very honored that she is here. So with our chat today, let's kind of dive in. And one of the things as we kind of get into our conversation here, Cara, is there was a famous basketball coach, John Wooden, who led UCLA to multiple college championships in the 60s and 70s. Kareem Abdul-Jabbar played on his teams and things like this. And one of the things that he was famous for, and I played high school basketball and things like this, and our coach was a big acolyte of John Wooden as well, is the fundamentals. And he
Right.
would start practice and he would pick up a basketball and say, "This is a basketball," right? I mean, if you're a college player at the top of your game, yeah, of course you know that's a basketball. But what he's reminding people is that the basics are what count: how to dribble, how to pass, how to shoot, how to block, all of these type of things that are required to be successful in basketball. And he would always bring his team of these super elite athletes back to those basics.
Oh, for
And
sure.
yeah, and the reason I was thinking of that here today is this is the same with sanitation. And sanitation is one of those things that you always have to remember the basics. Sanitation is not fancy pants things, right? We're always coming up with the new and greatest thing, but sanitation always comes back to blocking and tackling.
Exactly. You're 100% right. And you have to do the basics, right?
Mhm.
In order to have appropriate sanitation. And it's not rocket science.
Mhm.
It's not, but understanding is half the battle.
Yeah,
And understanding just the basics of sanitation.
absolutely. So let's start with that. You're an expert in sanitation and ChemStation. So how do you define sanitation? What is sanitation?
Well, in my definition, or in the definition, is you clean. So you make
Mhm.
sure the 7 steps of sanitation, and I think we'll talk a little bit through those. That in making sure that you are doing that pickup, the dry clean, which I see that missed a lot, and then making sure the equipment is clean, and ensuring that the debris is removed, and then you apply the sanitizer,
Mhm.
and then you inspect, right? So the whole overall entire program is sanitation.
Right. And an important piece of this as well is sanitation is not one size fits all. So you have these basic pieces that you need to follow, but the plan needs to be set up correctly. And that's what I think of as validation. Do you agree with
Yes,
that?
I agree with that. Yep, yep, yeah. Understanding, you're exactly right. Meat producers are not going to have this exact same program as a produce producer, as a dairy producer. It's going to be, custom a bit to your facility, but the basic 7 steps of sanitation are going to drive the overall program, right?
Absolutely. And a big chunk of that then is first identifying, and this is why it's so important to partner with a sanitation chemical company to help you with this. Because again, like we talked about earlier, we don't know everything, right? And
Right.
there's people out there who specialize in these things, and that's their entire career, is understanding these particular segments. So really, it all kind of comes down to, there's really only three main things that we're playing with, right? We're playing with proteins, we're
Right.
playing with fats, and they're playing with carbohydrates. And that mixture is going to change, right?
Right. Yep. And you're going to have to, sometimes figure out what exactly you need in order to get rid of that stuff in your system. And then, depending on your commodity too, you might have, sometimes minerals and things like that too that you have to deal with. So that, it just depends, right, on your product and your commodity. But you definitely, again, the basics are going to be there, whether you're using caustic or acid or that, but then you can build those cleaners to make sure that your process is going to flow appropriately, and you're going to get rid of all of that material that's on your processing line.
Yeah. So a big chunk of that then too is, your processing parameters. So if you are manufacturing products that are cold and not using a lot of heat, it's going to be different than hot. And you'll say, well, why is that different? It's like, okay, well, if you're using a hot process, let's say then you have burn on your surfaces.
Yeah.
How do you
Yeah.
clean that, right? You have to figure
Yeah.
that out.
Yeah, or it's really important that if you're processing something that you don't, use too hot of chemistry, and or a water rinse or things like that, and you burn it on there, because then you're really at it, then that just complicates things. You have to understand the soil identification is really important.
Exactly. Well, the other big category then as well too is dry clean versus wet clean, right?
And we get so many questions, right? About how do you go about dry cleaning? How do you go? And there are lots of workshops and things like that around dry cleaning, that are, and you just, if you are a dry environment, keep it dry. That's going to be your best resource, right? That's going to be the best way to tackle the sanitation process. And you not necessarily want to add that water to the system, because it's going to just complicate things potentially.
Yeah. And so in my mind, I'm kind of visualizing that. Let's say that you're making flour, and all of a sudden you go in there to clean your equipment and you douse everything in water. And now you've created this goopy flour paste that
Gum.
sticks to
Yep.
everything. And now the bacteria that are there are going, oh, awesome. I couldn't really grow too well without water.
Yeah.
Now I've got
Like,
plenty of
thanks,
water. What can you get?
guys.
Yeah, appreciate it. Now I've got food and water and temperature. Now I've got the perfect environment for growth. So you've actually made things worse.
Yep, exactly. Because remember, bacteria love, they're living. So they need food, they need water. Depending on what they are, they might need oxygen or they might not need oxygen. So all those things are dependent for their survival and their growth. And
Yeah.
so if you're adding water, you could potentially be helping them along, right? You're
Mhm.
you're helping them to make a home and to harbor in there.
Yeah, exactly. So as you're going through this, you're figuring all these things out. You're saying, okay, so what type of soils do I have? What type of cleaning process do I need? All these type of activities. And then the next big one for me then, Cara, is kind of the three main buckets that I look at cleaning in. There's CIP, clean in place,
Yep.
which people think of as pushing a button, but that's not necessarily true.
There's a lot more to it.
COP, yeah,
Yeah.
clean out of place, right? And then hand cleaning, right? And
Yeah.
all three of these things, people think that, oh, I work in the CIP plant and all I have to do is push this button and everything takes care of itself. That's never the case.
No, no, never the case. You need to, enlist the help of an expert in CIP in order to make sure that your program, there's so many parameters, right? Flow, concentration, all of that plays into water temperature, all plays into the effectiveness of that sanitation for CIP. But I agree with you. Or, the one that I tend to see is people skip steps.
Oh,
you they tend to override the system, and it's like, do we really need to do this wash? Nah, skip. Oh boy, that's when you start running into problems. So
right. And people have to remember, and this is an important thing now with FSMA, is sanitation is a preventive control.
yep,
FDA has said that this is something so critical to your process that it is absolutely essential to food safety. So you cannot cut corners. And this is something that we see in food companies a lot, because operations and management will look at this and say, guys, this 8 hour sanitation window that we have is really eating up a lot of our production time. Wouldn't it be nice if we cut that down to 4 hours and we had an extra 4 hours of production where it wasn't costing us money and we could make more product, right? So sanitation is always under time pressure.
they're under time constraints, and it's quite unfair, right? Because and again, I'm biased a bit, but it's one of the most important processes in your overall system, right?
Yeah.
If you start with dirty lines, if you start with dirty equipment, it's, no matter how clean your ingredients are, they're going to become contaminated in the process. So if you start clean, it's easier to keep it clean, right? Right.
Yeah.
That's the biggest thing. And again, and I know I told you this, but one of my first days, I started my career basically at Oscar Mayer. And one of my first days at Oscar Mayer, my boss at the time, Joe Meyer, said, Cara, all you have to know is that sterilized poop is still poop. So you have to keep things clean. You have to make sure that you're cleaning and ensure your system is clean,
Mhm.
because it's not going to get any better if it's not.
Yeah. So, I mean, just even from a practical standpoint, think about it. If you go to wash your car in the driveway and the car is covered in mud and salt and it's pretty dirty, and you just take the hose and kind of like put a little water on it and start scrubbing away, ain't going to work.
Right.
You're going to get done and the car is still going to be dirty. There's a process you have to go through to clean the car properly. And you
It's
can't cut corners. Let's say, for example, also you're cleaning your house and you decide, I've got a lot of fun stuff I'm going to do this weekend, and I'm going to speed up my cleaning of the house and get the vacuuming and the dusting and everything done in half the time. Are you going to do a good job? No. Cleaning takes time.
time and effort, right? and
Yeah.
and and understanding, right? And when I teach sanitation classes, one example that we give is, if you have a plate and let's say you spread manure on it, and then you just rinse it with some water, are you going to eat off of that? Are you going to put your sandwich on that? I'm not. I
Yeah.
that's not the appropriate way to clean your plate. And that I think people lose sight sometimes. It is, I understand, we're trying to make money, we're trying to produce for our customers, but it is still food, and it does, people eat it, right? And
Mhm.
that's where you just have to think about, okay, would I eat this? Would I ingest this that's coming off of my line?
Yeah, absolutely. Um, and on that note too, right, is two key things here that we're talking about. These things are kind of popping into mind as we're talking here. Is something that people forget about too is water, right? What's your
Right.
water like going into your plant?
Yes.
Is it hard water? Are there lots of minerals in there? Because these things can really mess with your chemicals, right?
Absolutely. You absolutely need to understand your water chemistry in order to make sure that your chemistry is going to work with your water. And a lot of times people just lose sight of that, right?
Yeah.
They don't understand the implications. And it's really interesting. I live in Wisconsin, where the water is quite hard. And so there's different things that you got to do in order to make sure that your chemistry is working appropriately.
Yeah.
And people forget about that. That's a little caveat that people forget about that.
Here's a good question from Mohammed, and I'm going to put up your question here on the screen, Mohammed. So he would like to know, Cara, could you mention the best way to check the effectiveness of CIP, and if there is a quicker way also? Good question.
Yeah. So I guess, you're talking about just you need to do the checks of temperature, time, flow rate. Usually what we have is we just have a checklist that we go through for the verification. So that's just your verification process. Usually it's done annually or semi-annually, depending. Now, if you switch commodities or you switch any kind of anything, your chemistry, your ingredients, your process flow, you have to redo that validation to ensure that you are actually cleaning. But the verification, and ATP, you can do the ATP swabbing after, or do some micro testing after in certain areas. And I always recommend doing it in the really hard to reach, the hard to get to kind of areas, your gaskets and things like that, so that you're ensuring that you're getting that.
And we'll talk about this a little later as well too, Mohammed. And so inspection, and then also rinse water testing. So we'll talk a little bit more about those later on too. And here's another good one as well too. And Joanne knows this one very well from our past experience, is product changes. So example, if you go in and you're making a new product in a production facility, those parameters are going to be different. So a lot of times I would ask that question and say, okay, we're running this new product and it's very sticky and it's very messy. Have we validated this process? And a lot of times this is what I would get back. A whole lot of crickets. And so, for example, from my past experience in this example is we had a production plant that was making soy milk, and we added almond milk to this facility.
No, why'd you do that?
Well, I didn't want to. I did not want to. But we were tasked with getting this thing done, and it was a gigantic challenge. So if anybody is familiar with almond paste, think of peanut butter and add a stickiness factor of 10 to that.
Oh my goodness. Yep.
And now all of a sudden we had a product that was manufactured before, and both of these products were manufactured moving forward. So we had to be able to switch between these two different allergens and make sure that it was clean. And it took us months to get this right, because as is always the case, your plant is what it is. And you have an existing set of equipment and processes and these type of things that were set up for what was there. And you now have to go in and change those things. And we had a very good company that was working with us on these type of things. But to give an example, one of the sticking points for us in this process was batching, as you can imagine. And we would then go back and clean the system, and we would test and look for residual almond in the system. And we had a batching tank. It was probably about a 10,000 or so gallon tank. And we had calculated the amount of residue in that tank that was required for a positive on the allergen test on the rinse water. And it was about, see if you said, like this little cap here through that entire tank was enough to trigger a positive allergen result, which would mean then too, that if someone had an allergic reaction to almonds, it would make them sick.
Absolutely.
So back to the board, we would have to clean again and again. And it was a very enlightening process. So you have to understand, and I think that was a really good example of how these things work, because it pulls everything together, is that validation, right? You cannot, once you have things set up for a particular product, it's not as simple as just flipping a switch and changing it to something else.
Right. Yep, exactly. Yeah, especially if you're switching, to an allergenic product or a stickier, like you say, just even if you're making a different type of commodity. So.
Yep, absolutely. And so we got some really good comments here coming.
Yes, very good. I see them coming.
So if you validated, Duncan, that's a good comment here. If you validated that CIP is effective, sometimes you only need to do something like pH or rinse water to verify that the allergens have been rinsed off for each CIP cycle. And that's the whole point. Is when you set this up correctly, you stick to your plan, And then you're
Yep.
verifying that your plan is working correctly. So a good example of this would be the metal detector. So you buy a new metal detector in your plant and you install it, and the technician from the metal detector company comes in. You don't do this, right? They come in and they set it up and they make sure the field strength is correct and that they have the right check weights for that, for the ferrous and non-ferrous and the stainless little check balls that run through for the verification.
Right.
And then what do? They lock that system down, don't they? They
Yep.
set it up so that the
Exactly.
operators can't go in there and play with those buttons any longer. It has been validated, and it's very important in that aperture size, the speed of the belt, the position of the product, the type of product, the size of the product. All these things come into play to make sure that that metal detector is functioning correctly for the intended purpose. And then the only reason for those little check runs that you run through every hour or so is to make sure that everything is working correctly. You're verifying. So to
Yep.
Duncan's point, you don't go back and revalidate everything. Once it's set, you keep it that way. And it's the same with
Yep.
sanitation.
Yep. Exactly. Exactly. Unless, like you talked about, you change, you have a significant change in the process
Right.
or the product, then you may need to redo that validation once again. And I do want to, just acknowledge that you had talked about the preventive controls regulation and sanitation being a preventive control. Now, according to that regulation, sanitation does not need to be validated. It does have verification expectations, but with a lot of the GFSI schematics, validation is required. And also, it's a best practice, right?
Right.
It is a best practice. And just because it's not written into that regulation doesn't mean that, you don't have that expectation.
Right.
Do the right thing, right?
Right.
And
Well,
and
and I think too, right? And this is kind of where it gets weird in the chemical side of things. And this is where the expertise from chemical companies comes in very handy as well, is the regulatory authority is very confusing relative to these. So forever it was EPA, right? So
yep.
EPA you would get your registrations and these type of things for these
For the
particular applications.
sanitizers, yep,
Yeah,
yep.
but they don't do that anymore, do they?
They still register sanitizers.
They
So they
register. Okay.
still, but then you have food contact notifications, which is held through the FDA.
Mm,
So you're right. And that could be a whole sanitizers could be a whole 3-day conversation.
yeah,
But
absolutely.
yeah, you're absolutely right. It is very confusing. There's
Right.
a lot of
I think
moving.
what you're making here is a very important point. And since, I mean, we spoke about this before and it got me curious. And so I started looking at this too. And I think a big piece of what FDA is saying here as well, Cara, is that these chemicals that are used for particular applications, so peracetic acid or what have you, are known. Their activities are known. Their efficacy is known and these type of things. So FDA in a lot of ways is saying, you don't need to reinvent the wheel on these things. We know that they work, but you have to show that they work in your application.
Exactly. Yep. Exactly.
And,
Exactly.
yes, and Virginia Dybel is here, which is awesome. So Cara and I both know Virginia. She is amazing. She has a great question here. Can you talk about risk assessments for bacterial lists that may influence chemical choices? Ooh, great question.
Yeah, that and I probably won't do it justice like Virginia would do it, but absolutely, different commodities have different risks for different microorganisms in general. Now, for instance, salmonella is highly associated with our poultry
Mhm.
industry. We've heard a lot about the especially romaine lettuce and E. coli O157H7, understanding what those mean, what those organisms and commodity risks are. Now, that being said, things can happen, right? We've had unexpected, or not necessarily unexpected, but different commodities associated with different microorganisms that we may not have thought about in the past, kind of thing.
Right.
But then how does that influence your chemical choices? So for instance, it's always been pretty widely known that quat sanitizers are pretty effective against listeria, and you get that residual activity with quaternary ammonia, or with quaternary quat sanitizers, and that is effective against those. The listeria is very commonly used in that application. Salmonella, like PAA or peracetic acid, is a very effective. The oxidizing chemistries are very effective against those gram-negative microorganisms. Now, not that they can't be used for each other, right? Read the label. All sanitizers are tested against gram-positive and gram-negative. They have to go through a certain testing schematic and pass in order to have that on the label. At those, and you also have to recognize the percentage or the parts per million, so the ppm that are listed on the label in order to have that efficacy, right? So you have to read the label on sanitizers. That's what I always go back to, right? Read your label, and that's going to help guide you. But if you have questions about that too, I would definitely reach out to your chemical provider. If you're struggling with something. But another thing is, and again, I'm sure Virginia would bring up this point too. If you're not cleaning appropriately, you can apply any sanitizer all the time and it's not going to be effective. So not getting rid of that, because organic material will bind up that sanitizer and it'll render it ineffective.
Absolutely.
So you have to do the basics like we talk about.
That's right. Well, and so something that popped to mind here as well is, so also it's the activity period. So for example, chlorine is a very effective sanitizer, but very short half-life. And if it comes into contact with soils, it's inactivated very, very quickly. So you see this a lot in foot baths. It's like, oh, I'll dump a bunch of chlorine in the foot bath. Okay, fine. But if it's in a high traffic area, it's going to be inactivated very quickly. Another one to think about as well, to kind of piggyback on what you're saying as well, Cara, is biofilms. Right? Something that we talked about on here before is, if you have something that has established a colony and it's got this nice little protective film around it, it's laughing at you, right? So you got to make sure you understand that. And number one, prevent that from happening. And if you have it, how do you get rid of it, right? So you need to understand these relative to these risks associated with your product.
Yeah. And Duncan brought up a really nice, market acceptance too. There are certain local regulations in other countries and things like that where certain sanitizers are allowable and some are not. So you have to understand what what the acceptance is in the location, right?
Well, on that point too, is your particular certification. So for example, if you're an organic product, you have to understand your regulations relative to that for use of sanitizers on organic products, because you can get yourself in trouble on those.
Absolutely. Yeah. And understand, it's maybe not that you can't use it, but there might be extra steps that you need to adhere to, right, in order to make sure that you're
and some sanitize, and this is always an interesting point on this side too, is that some sanitizers are no rinse, meaning that you apply them to a surface and then they evaporate off. Other ones are not, and you may have to rinse them afterwards, which in and of itself could be a problem, because let's say that you have water that's contaminated. Now you just reintroduced something to that surface.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Virginia had a good follow-up question here as well. Does rotating chemicals really help?
So it depends, right? I'm going to give you the standard micro answer. It depends. And it used to be that, you got to rotate sanitizers, and that was kind of the previous thought. And now people are, kind of coming to the fact that if you found something that's working, why would you change it? And I run into this a lot with customers, where they'll hear something like, we should rotate sanitizers. And it's like, well, but you're not having an issue and you're running quite well. So, maybe we don't want to, it's just kind of like what we're saying with validation. We may not want to do that. We may not want to switch up our program just to switch up our program. Let's do it in an effective manner. And that's where, you have to think about, but if, let's say, you're having some micro issues, okay, well, let's do a deep dive. Is it, is changing your chemistry around really going to help you? Or do we just need to do a better job of, you were talking about manual cleaning, you know, are they taking the shields off? Are they getting underneath? Are things getting missed? Is the training right for the sanitarians? Have they
Yeah.
been trained appropriately? You know, or is there, you know, is there another corrective action rather than switching up that chemistry? So
Yeah, and so yeah, Duncan, great minds think alike here. He's kind of thinking along the same lines, right? So alternating between alkalins and alkalides, and using chlorination can be a good approach, but it depends on the species. And this
yes,
is where I think it comes into play, and it's really important having. It gets back to a comment you made earlier, Cara, which is very important, which is you don't have to be an expert in everything, but you have to know people who are.
yeah,
And being able to reach out and having a good relationship, right? Your chemical company is just not somebody you buy stuff from. They're a valuable resource. They're a company that can help. They want you to be successful, and they want you to buy the right stuff and apply it correctly. Because part of, and we've talked about this before, is there is this false belief in facilities, especially among the sanitation teams, that more is better.
yep,
And it's like, okay, if it's not getting clean, I'll just add more chemicals. No.
yep, yeah, yeah, yeah. Yeah, absolutely. And that, you know, I always call it the glug glug method, right? You know, sometimes people are like, well, glug glug, glug glug glug. And it's not the right way to do it, right?
Yeah.
And more isn't always better.
No.
And
Yeah.
um uh I actually experienced one where a company was having lots of lactic acid bacteria counts, and they were doing a mid-shift clean. So it was a turkey bacon facility, and they're
Uh-huh.
having lots of you know, lactics and spoilage. It wasn't anything harmful, but it was just spoilage, which is, you know, detrimental to your brand. And they were doing a mid-shift clean. Well, in the mid-shift clean, they were just hosing everything down and then sanitizing it. Well, that was just adding water to the system. And as
Hmm.
soon as they removed that mid-sift clean, their counts went down because,
Ah,
again, we kept that water out. We didn't, you know, it wasn't effective. It wasn't an effective form of sanitation. And it was just adding to the problem. So
yeah.
sometimes more isn't better, but make sure that you do your due diligence, you know, because sometimes you do have to do those mid-shift cleans to get some of those nutrients out of there, as long as you
Mhm.
do it effectively.
Yeah. So two things that came to mind based upon what you're saying there is that it's also your product and what you're making. So let's say, for example, that you're making a cultured product and you're making cheese or yogurt or something like this. Those are good bacteria and you don't want to kill them.
Right.
So you don't want to be
Exactly.
introducing things into the process that are going to kill your starter cultures.
Yep, exactly. Exact, and that is important too, right? And we, you know, in our line of work, we hear a lot about phage. And again, we can go for days on that conversation. But that again, you know, trying to mitigate that in the system, a lot of it is just keeping your environment clean, and
Yeah.
not letting that like whey run on the floor and things like that, so that you're keeping it a clean environment, and that's going to help you in getting rid of that and not having that issue happen. So
And when you're sampling is also important. So, for example, let's say that you're looking to figure out, like you were talking about with your lactic bacteria or things of this nature. If you're sampling after you apply the sanitizer, is that really telling you what you need to know? Probably not, right? It's why you do your environmental monitoring test before, right? You want actual active sampling, and on that point, it's a completely different conversation. But around environmental monitoring in FDA's manual, if they're
mhm.
coming in and doing a swabathon, they're not sampling right after you clean. They want to sample 4 hours into production as a
Right.
measure of effectiveness.
Yeah, exactly. Yep, yep. Yeah. Yeah, and there's a ton of good conversation going on in the chat here.
Oh yeah.
You know, and you know, and Duncan kind of alluded to it here is, you know, different scenarios require, there's Sinner Circle. If anybody's familiar with Sinner Circle, it's the time, temperature, product selection, you know, concentration, and all of those add to the pie, right? And you think about each of those as being a segment of the pie. If you reduce one, you're going to have to increase another and to perform. But again, it's different scenarios, and that's why you can't just cookie cutter a sanitation program from one location to another, even if you have the exact same location, because you don't have the exact same
No.
people
Yeah.
in that location. You don't have the exact same equipment. You don't have the exact same external environment. Is it humid? Is it, is it a dry? Are you in the desert kind of thing? So
Ooh.
all
Ooh.
that
Yeah.
adds to it, right? I know that you try and control your climate in your interior climate, but it all adds up, right? So you have to really do your due diligence in that.
Right. Yeah. I think it comes back to a comment that we made earlier, which is cleaning is not done just by pushing a button.
Right.
It's an involved, complicated process which requires constant monitoring and evaluation. So to your point, Cara, if let's say you have 2 plants and you just say, "Oh, I'll just follow the same process in my new plant," and to your point, the people, right, different people doing the cleaning, but also let's say, for example, you have in your CIP system a slightly different pump where the gallon per minute flow rate is just a little bit lower. Now it's not the same.
It's not the same, right? Exactly. Yeah. So you just, and again, you're gonna have to do your due diligence and understand. And a lot of it, again, goes back. The water is a perfect example. Water
Mhm.
in Wisconsin is very different than water in California. Understanding that, because that's going to depend for your chemistry and things like that too. So you have to
Yeah.
do your due diligence.
And to complicate matters more, we've talked about this on here a little bit before. We won't get into it too much, but in a lot of plants now, they have reclaimed water. So they will use, as we talked about, cow water, right, which is the recycled water from the cheese manufacturing process. And they'll use that for
Like
rinses and
pre-rinse.
secondary cleaning
Yeah,
activities. And
yeah,
that can impact your process as well. So you need to understand that too.
absolutely. Right. And yeah, we won't get into into that, but all of it, and that's the thing. I think that's the thing that people don't understand. Like you say, it's not just pushing a button. There's a lot of
Mm.
pre-work that goes into it.
Oh
So
my goodness, yes. And so let's so kind of keeping on the topic of blocking and tackling, I listed out here in my notes. So some of the basic steps of sanitation. So let's see if I missed anything here, Cara. So
mhm.
first off, as we talked about, first you got to remove the soil and debris.
Right.
Right? So you have to get the surface as clean as you can. Then you're going to rinse all your residues, apply your detergents with physical action. Right.
Right.
So even in CIP systems, right, you've got spray balls that are applying physical force through that water to those surfaces. Rinse the equipment, inspect for missed spots,
Hmm.
and then sanitize.
Right. Yep, exactly. And the inspection is, and again, was on just not that long ago talking about sustainability. And if you think about, and again, everybody is very, water is a limited commodity, right? We're trying to conserve water. If you miss that inspection, and or if you're not doing those first 4 steps where you're removing all of that debris, you're going to re-clean, you're going to be adding more chemistry, more water to the process.
Mhm.
And you have to do that, you want to get rid of that, but again, it's time and it's money that you're utilizing. So
Yeah.
making sure you do that inspection and do it right the first time. And removing all that soil and debris initially, one of the things that I see quite frequently is people, and again, I'm just using it as an example, but taking a high pressure hose and chasing that one piece, that one cheese curd across the floor. Yes, just getting that down the drain. It's like, oh my goodness, all you have to do is just kind of sweep it together and gather it up and throw it out, and you're not, utilizing all that water for that. So
Right. And yeah, you want to make a QA food safety person mad is do that
yeah.
because all the aerosols that you've just undone all your work. You've just
Exactly.
created this massive plume of who knows what that is now settling over everything in your nice, pretty, clean manufacturing room.
Yeah,
Good.
exactly. So
Brr.
making sure that you do all of that. And those are the, a lot of things that I see are missed in the process of
Yeah.
the sanitation steps. So,
Yeah, and I wanted to talk a little bit more too about the inspection piece of it.
yep.
So part of this too is don't inspect your own work, right? So never ask the sanitation person who is cleaning a piece of equipment to be the person that checks off and verifies that the equipment is clean. No, right? You wouldn't do that in the lab. Don't do that on the floor. So make sure that you have, and this is something I've done in the past. So a company I used to work for on third shift, which is something that I don't quite understand too, and this is something you can think about, is why does sanitation have to happen on third shift? Why can't it happen during the day? Right? So think about that. But the other piece of that is the inspection. So on third shift, I had a QA technician who worked on third shift, who was there to do testing on the production for the day and these type of things. But her main purpose in being there was to support the sanitation team. And she was out on the floor helping with the sanitation process, doing checks. And the important part is at the end of the sanitation process, she was the person performing the inspections. And until she said this equipment is clean and I sign off on it, she would not run. The plant was not allowed to run. And she was tough. So it wasn't just a visual, oh, okay, this looks good. No, she would say, okay, this pump here, I want you to take the plate off. I want to look at the lobes. Because
Wow.
she
She
knew
knew. Yeah.
where the dirty spots are. And this goes back to a comment that was made earlier in the chat. She knew where the problem areas were, and she would
Right.
check those.
Yeah. And that's important to understand, right?
Yeah.
And that again, was in a facility where never looked under things. They're having a mold issue, and it was pretty simple. Now I'm only 5'3", so under things for me is
Mhm.
like relatively easy. But looking under things, we looked under the equipment, and there was literally 5 inches of mold just
Mhm.
growing under there because they didn't think to get down and look under.
Yeah.
But that, kind of goes back to where we were talking about hand cleaning and COP and CIP. If you make it easier to inspect, so if you raise that equipment just slightly, so people don't have to, get down so far or get a camera or things like that, make it easier to be able to conduct that. That's going to help in
Oh,
the
that's a
overall
great point.
process.
Yeah, because two comments on that, because that's a great jumping point here, is that the sanitation crew, just like everybody else, are people.
Right.
And if something is difficult, if something is hard to do, if something is wet and dirty, and I'd say, okay, are you going to go, yay, I want to go do that? Probably not.
Yeah.
So those areas may become overlooked. So how can you make that easier? And I think that ties into what you're talking about is sanitary design, which is just not the design of the equipment itself, which we'll talk about a little bit, but also how the equipment is placed, what's the accessibility? Because a lot of times, let's say that we get a new piece of equipment, number one, right? That's a whole nother thing, right? Is okay, the equipment is normally purchased for operational efficiency. How many pieces of product can this piece of equipment move? How does this fit in with our existing equipment? These type of things. Is it a good price? Okay, we'll jam it over here in this area on the production floor because it fits, and that's good enough. Okay, but what if it's against the wall
Yep.
and you can't get to it to clean?
No. Yeah, exactly. The accessibility, right? And it's like you were saying, if it's hard, people aren't going to do it. So if
Yeah.
you have a shield, let's say, and it's held on by 15 bolts, that you have to now get a socket wrench to remove all those every night. When you're pressed for time, are you gonna get that out and remove all 15 of those bolts? Probably not. So
Right.
making it easy and accessible and very easy to remove is going to help the process
Right.
for the sanitation process.
Wow. And guys, I love this because the comments in here are absolutely amazing. There is a course here on the different things that you should be thinking about. And it's just
Absolutely.
highlighting how difficult sanitation is. So as
Yeah.
Virginia is talking about is denaturation of products, the sanitary design, giving people the right tools. Give them a freaking flashlight so that they can actually look into these different types of equipment and figuring these things out. So a lot of times, and so something that you need to look at, and you need to have, and this goes for so many things in a plant, and we'll highlight it in this area as well, is the time to think about things is before, not after. Because I can't remember the number of times where I've gone into one of my plants and I'll be going on a tour and looking around, and I haven't been there in a few months or whatever. And I'm like, what's that new piece of equipment? Who bought that? Oh yeah, we found that screaming deal. It was this piece of equipment laying out in a field somewhere.
I was just going to say it was in the parking lot.
Yeah, where's this thing been? What is it, right? So one of the rules I always put in place was nothing changes in the plant. If food safety is impacted, nothing changes until the food safety team has approved it. Nothing changes.
Yeah.
And if the equipment goes in ahead of time, that's a huge violation. And I'm going to be having some conversations if I find that out. So part of that then is back again to the equipment design. Equipment is designed for efficiency. It's not designed in most cases for cleanability. And to Duncan's point as well with cleaners, Europe has different standards for equipment than the US. In the US, we have 3A sanitary design in these guidelines and rules, and experts like Alan Saylor, who's been here on the chat, talking about these things on how equipment is designed. So for example, one of the main rules in 3A sanitary design of equipment is threaded surfaces. If you have a food contact area and you have threaded surfaces, so think bolts and screws and things like this, those are non-cleanable.
Right.
Stuff gets up in those. You cannot have those. In Europe, that rule isn't really, because there's been plenty of equipment that I've looked at, and it's in use in Europe and France and other companies that I've been to. And cool equipment, not allowable in the US because it's not designed to US sanitary rules. And you need to understand these.
Yes, yeah, for sure. Well, and historical equipment, right? I mean, and that's the nice way to say old equipment, right?
Yeah.
A lot of times it just wasn't a thought. You're absolutely right. It was designed for production efficiency, and I like to think that we're getting better, and involving more food safety personnel in design and setup and things like that. I like to think that and like you say, that's impressive that you can't change the equipment setup unless the food safety has that sign off. That right. Feels like a best practice to me for sure.
You need to, as the food safety person, you need to be involved in those conversations way up front, because if you're not, you're going to be dealing with the aftermath from that point forward.
Absolutely, for sure. Yeah. Yes.
Another big piece of this that kind of popped in my head as well is what type of materials is it made of? Older equipment a lot of times is not made of 300 series stainless steel. It's who knows what type of metal. And this interacts with the sanitation side of things too, right? Is if you're
100%.
If you're using chlorinated cleansers on surfaces that are not designed for that, you can get pitting.
And if that happens, just leads to potential contamination, hang up and things like that. Yeah. And a couple of my friends who've been in sanitation for decades will have stories about how they didn't know what the metal type was. And so they just used, what they normally use. I have a friend that owned a cheese company, and he was talking about a silo that had an auger in it, and the auger, and I can't remember exactly what the makeup of it was, but it was a soft metal, and he used an extremely harsh chemical, and he went to look after cleaning, and the auger was gone because it had disintegrated. But it was one of those where he's like, oh, well, this is what I normally do. So why wouldn't I? It was a brand new piece of equipment, but it wasn't compatible with the chemistry. So you have to understand that.
Well, and that's a good point. And this is where, as we talk about in here, where things interact, in that part of your inspection process after sanitation is making sure that everything is still there.
Right?
Right? So are all the bolts in place? Are the Teflon scrapers there? Are the little cotter pins that hold them in place? Are they there? Is
Right.
everything there? Because if you wait, now all of a sudden it's like, oh, right? That's
Yeah.
the time to find these things, is before they can get in the product, because that is always frustrating from a quality side. Is the next day somebody says, oh, hey, we're missing a piece of equipment. Now, as the quality food safety person, you're like, okay, where is it? And
Yeah.
everybody's like, I don't know, right? Could be in the product, could not be in the product, could be somewhere in a drain. We don't know. And then you're
Could be
like,
on a shelf somewhere. That's the best case scenario,
yeah,
right?
you're like, okay, everything goes on hold. We got to find it. Because as we've talked about before, metal detectors are great, X-ray are great, but they're not a panacea. They don't do everything. They don't make up for good practices.
Exactly, right? And that's where it comes down to, right? The best practice.
Yeah,
So,
and so I think that's a good way to kind of bring this back up to the 30,000 point, foot level, because, oh, boys, it's been a good chat today. Lots of
it
great
went
conversation.
fast.
Oh man, all these great comments, right? Sanitation is
Absolutely.
something, it's kind of like this, forgotten stepchild sitting in the back room. Nobody thinks about it, but oh my God, sanitation is so important. What are, as a professional in this area, Cara, what are some of those big mistakes out there that you see people making?
Well, and it's just like we talked about the basics, right?
Mm.
And everybody's like, "Oh, we just need to add more chemistry, or we need to change our chemistry." Let's just go back to the basics. Let's see, are we truly doing that manual cleaning that we need to do? Are we training? The training piece, people oftentimes will overlook that, where people just don't understand the importance of simple things like removing all the product at the beginning. Duncan was making comments about that, making sure that it is all removed, and that you are doing the best that you can. But that training piece, that's a lot of times what I see get overlooked or glossed over. And I understand it's time, it's money, but having people understand what they're doing is really important.
Oh, that's a great summary, right? This kind of brings it back full circle to our beginning, right? This is a basketball. This is
Right.
sanitation. And one of the challenges on sanitation, because it's on third shift, is lots of turnover. And
Yes.
it's a hard job. You're in PPE and you're hot and it's moist and you're sweaty and you're crawling under stuff and you're hitting your
You're
knuckles and
wet. Yeah,
oh my,
yeah,
it's hard work. And a lot of people are like, oh no, I don't, and they quit, right? And so, but this is why it's so important to have that training up front and teach them.
yeah,
And one of the quick little tips here that I've learned on this as well is create your sanitation program based on a modular approach, meaning don't write your procedures on a particular piece of equipment. Here's how you clean this filler. Break it down and say, here's how you clean cleaning heads. Heating heads. Here is how you clean belts. Here's how you clean lines. Here is how you use floor mats, so that you can interchange these with different pieces of equipment, because the blocking and tackling remains the same. And the problem I've seen, Cara, time and time again, is you write this gigantic procedure on how to clean a particular piece of equipment that changes a week later, because the
right,
equipment is constantly changing as well. So
right.
it just makes it extremely difficult to maintain that documentation. So don't fall into that trap. And that's a whole nother conversation I can get into there on how to create
Absolutely.
proper processes.
Yeah,
Um,
no, that would be a great workshop.
oh yeah.
That would be a wonderful workshop.
Yep. And
Yeah,
absolutely. And a lot of these things that you're hearing are based upon real world
right?
experience, based upon screwing stuff up. So
I was just gonna say, I have screwed many a thing up, right? Many a thing, and that's how you learn, right? You can't be perfect all the time. So.
exactly. So as we close out our chat here for today, I can't believe we're out of time already. Is there any upcoming activities or things that you're doing, Cara? I know you're always all over the place. Anything
Yeah.
you want people to know about?
Well, ChemStation is actually, we're going to be having our ChemStation Institute in October.
Ooh.
It's going to be about sanitation, obviously, but we're also going to be talking food safety culture and food and root cause analysis. And we've got some amazing speakers coming in Yvonne Masters and Deb Kane
Ooh.
and Neil Bogart. Yeah, we're super excited. So if you are interested, my email's right there. Shoot me an email. Or if you have questions, yeah, which way it is. Yeah, very excited about that up and coming. Yeah, and I got, there'll be other conferences and things like that, I'm sure, rolling around here pretty soon. So
Yep.
very excited.
And so for me, as I mentioned last week, I created and rolled out, and I'm so excited about this, the food safety chat database. So this is episode 140, believe it or
Which I
not,
can't believe.
140
I
episodes.
can't believe it.
And I've created a database of all of the courses, and I've arranged them by topic and module. And I've created podcasts, and I put my notes in there and resource materials, all these type of things for an easy access. So if you want to do a deep dive into sanitation, you can go in there and re-listen to and get all of the information of what's been communicated to you relative to sanitation. So it's an amazing tool, and I put it out
Yeah,
there
and
with the hope
I got a
that
pre-look, so it is amazing. It's so informative, so informative.
yeah, so I'm really excited about this. So with this, for a special limited time here for my viewers on this, I've created a special discount on this. So if you reach out to me, and so to that point, my email here, drop me a line, and I'll give you a discount and lifetime access to the database. And so the only thing I ask in that is, give me a little feedback. Let me know what you think, because we can always make things better. And I've created this database out there for everybody, because as we talk about on this here, food safety is not a point of competition, and this is for everyone. And the more that we can share this information with everybody, the better off we're all going to be. So I appreciate everybody's support and help in that goal. And just watching our chat here today just makes me smile, because all of the
So
amazing
awesome.
comments and help here is just fantastic. So thank you, everyone.
Yeah, so awesome. And I love, this is just a conversation, right? And I love that about this. It's so amazing.
Yes.
And I appreciate being involved.
And
Very
having you on. And so being able to have experts like Cara who come on here and invest her time like everyone else here is doing as well, just makes everything so much better. So thanks again. And join us next week at the same time, next Friday at 8 a.m. Mountain, 10 a.m. Eastern, for the next food safety chat, where we'll have the honor of bringing another expert on the show to have another conversation. So everybody, once again, you did a great job this week. Enjoy your weekend, sit back and relax, and we'll see you back here next Friday. And thank you, Cara, as well. And thank you,
Yes.
everyone. And we'll see you next week.
Bye. Have a good weekend, all.